In the late 1960s, as NATO planners confronted the structural imbalance between forward-stationed Warsaw Pact forces and the majority of heavy American combat power located in the continental United States, a logistical solution emerged that would become one of the most consequential reinforcement mechanisms of the Cold War: POMCUS, or pre-positioning of materiel configured in unit sets. Rather than permanently basing every U.S. armored and mechanized division in Europe, which would have imposed immense political, financial, and family stationing burdens, NATO adopted a model in which complete sets of tanks, artillery, armored vehicles, engineering equipment, and support assets were stored in climate-controlled warehouses across West Germany, ready to be issued to personnel flown in during crisis. This concept transformed warehouses into strategic assets because they reduced transatlantic deployment time dramatically by separating heavy equipment movement from personnel movement. The earliest POMCUS initiatives began modestly, focusing on storing equipment for select brigades, but as NATO war planning shifted toward forward defense and rapid reinforcement, the scale expanded significantly, creating large storage complexes dispersed across the Federal Republic of Germany. These facilities were not simple storage sheds, but hardened depots engineered to preserve combat vehicles for extended periods, with humidity control systems, regular maintenance rotations, fuel stabilization procedures, and detailed inventory tracking to ensure that equipment remained fully mission capable. Maintenance personnel performed scheduled inspections, started engines, rotated lubricants, and replaced aging components to prevent degradation, acknowledging that dormant armor required continuous attention if it were to be combat-ready at short notice. Each POMCUS site was configured to match specific unit structures, meaning that vehicles were arranged in complete battalion and brigade sets down to communications gear, bridging equipment, and spare parts, enabling arriving personnel to draw a coherent, operational package rather than a collection of miscellaneous platforms. The strategic rationale was straightforward yet profound. If soldiers could be transported by air within days while their heavy equipment awaited them in Europe, NATO could compress reinforcement timelines sufficiently to deter a Warsaw Pact offensive before it achieved irreversible gains. The warehouses, therefore, became central nodes within NATO's reinforcement doctrine, integrated into mobilization plans that specified which U.S. units would deploy to which depots under defined contingency scenarios. Geographic dispersal was deliberate, reducing vulnerability to concentrated attack and ensuring that no single strike could eliminate multiple complete equipment sets. Security at these sites was stringent, involving perimeter defenses, controlled access, and integration with host nation security forces, reflecting their status as high-value strategic targets. Intelligence agencies in both blocs understood the significance of POMCUS, and Warsaw Pact planning documents reportedly treated depot locations as priority objectives in early strike scenarios, recognizing that destruction or disruption of these warehouses would slow NATO reinforcement dramatically. Within NATO headquarters, POMCUS capacity influenced force structure decisions, allowing planners to maintain credible, heavy reinforcement potential without permanently expanding troop presence. Exercises such as Reforger tested the system repeatedly, measuring how quickly personnel could move from air arrival points to assigned depots, issue equipment, and transition to operational deployment. After-action reports from these exercises documented friction points, including delays in vehicle issue sequencing, railcar shortages for onward movement, and maintenance discrepancies that required correction. Each iteration refined procedures, improved depot organization, and enhanced coordination with German rail authorities and host nation support structures. Funding debates in the United States and Europe frequently referenced POMCUS readiness levels, as policymakers weighed the cost of warehouse expansion against the strategic advantage of rapid reinforcement. By the mid-1970s, the network of POMCUS warehouses represented a substantial forward logistical investment, embedding heavy armored capability into the European theater even in peacetime. The concept reshaped NATO war planning by redefining the relationship between geography and force presence, demonstrating that stored materiel could function as latent combat power awaiting activation. In doing so, POMCUS warehouses quietly prepared NATO for a potential European war by anchoring reinforcement credibility in steel, concrete, inventory control, and disciplined maintenance, rather than in abstract declarations of alliance commitment. As the POMCUS program expanded through the 1970s, its scale and sophistication increased in direct response to evolving NATO doctrine and persistent concern over Warsaw Pact numerical superiority in Central Europe. Planners within U.S. Army Europe and NATO's Central Army Group calculated that the first days of any conflict would be decisive, and that reinforcement delays measured in weeks rather than days would render forward defense untenable. POMCUS therefore became a structural answer to this timeline problem, with additional warehouse complexes constructed in carefully selected locations across West Germany to support multiple heavy divisions. Sites were typically positioned near major rail corridors and highway networks to facilitate rapid onward movement once equipment was issued, linking depot geography directly to operational deployment routes. Engineering standards for the warehouses reflected their strategic importance, with reinforced construction, climate control systems designed to stabilize temperature and humidity, and secure storage arrangements that preserved optics, communications equipment, and sensitive components. Detailed accountability procedures tracked every vehicle, spare part, and weapon system, integrating depot inventory management into centralized logistics databases to ensure configuration accuracy. Each unit set was organized according to specific tables of organization and equipment, allowing arriving brigades to draw complete combat packages that match their stateside structure. This level of precision reduced confusion during crisis mobilization and minimized the time required to integrate equipment with personnel. Maintenance cycles were institutionalized, with U.S. Army personnel permanently assigned in Europe to conduct routine checks, rotate fluids, replace batteries, and prevent corrosion, transforming what might have been static storage into an active readiness mission. Exercises such as Reforger repeatedly validated and stress-tested POMCUS performance, documenting how long it took for units to process through depots, draw vehicles, load ammunition, and move toward defensive sectors. Data from these exercises revealed incremental improvements over time, as depot layout adjustments reduced congestion and standardized issue procedures accelerated throughput. Coordination with host nation authorities became formalized through agreements governing rail allocation, convoy routing, and infrastructure prioritization during mobilization, embedding POMCUS within a broader network of German civil-military cooperation. Intelligence reporting from the Warsaw Pact indicated sustained attention to depot locations and capacity, underscoring that POMCUS sites were recognized as strategic enablers whose neutralization could slow NATO reinforcement. This awareness influenced NATO dispersal strategy, ensuring that equipment sets were spread across multiple facilities rather than concentrated in a few large complexes. Funding allocations during this period reflected bipartisan recognition in Washington that forward prepositioning reduced the political and financial burden of permanently stationed forces while preserving heavy combat capability in theater. As NATO adopted forward defense concepts that emphasized holding ground near the inner German border rather than trading space for time, POMCUS became even more central to sustaining sufficient mass at the outset of hostilities. War planning documents incorporated explicit timelines linking personnel airlift to depot issue and onward movement, converting POMCUS readiness into measurable operational variables. The warehouses thus evolved from a logistical innovation into a doctrinal cornerstone, shaping alliance assumptions about how quickly reinforcements could stabilize a front under pressure. By the late 1970s, POMCUS infrastructure represented a substantial physical embodiment of NATO's commitment to defend Europe, consisting not only of armored vehicles and artillery, but of hardened buildings, maintenance crews, standardized procedures, and integrated transport networks that together translated strategic intent into deployable combat power on short notice. By the early 1980s, the POMCUS system had grown into a multi-layered network of storage complexes capable of equipping multiple heavy divisions, and its integration into NATO war planning became increasingly precise as the alliance adopted doctrines that emphasized rapid maneuver and sustained conventional resistance. The United States expanded the scope of prepositioned materiel beyond initial brigade sets to include full divisional configurations, support units, engineering assets, and logistics enablers, ensuring that arriving formations could operate independently without waiting for supplemental shipments. Each POMCUS site was linked to designated U.S. units stationed in the continental United States, with deployment plans specifying which division would draw from which warehouse, under defined contingency scenarios. These assignments were embedded into operational plans, converting static storage locations into activation nodes within the alliance's defense architecture. Maintenance discipline intensified during this period, with inspection schedules standardized and documentation systems upgraded to track readiness at granular levels, including vehicle mileage equivalents, component replacement cycles, and battery life projections. Depot personnel maintained engines in preservative states while conducting periodic operational checks to confirm mechanical reliability, recognizing that dormant armored vehicles could deteriorate rapidly without sustained attention. Ammunition storage protocols were refined in parallel, with separate but coordinated facilities holding munitions configured to match prepositioned weapon systems, ensuring that combat units would not face shortages upon activation. The relationship between POMCUS and strategic mobility became even more explicit as airlift capabilities expanded, allowing personnel to arrive in larger waves while heavy equipment remained securely stored in Europe. War games conducted at NATO headquarters incorporated updated POMCUS issue timelines into defensive models, refining assumptions about how quickly reinforcement brigades could be combat effective after landing. Exercises revealed that depot layout, vehicle parking configuration, and documentation flow significantly affected throughput, leading to incremental reorganization that reduced congestion and shortened processing time. Host nation support arrangements were formalized further, guaranteeing rail priority and convoy clearance for units departing POMCUS sites during crisis. Intelligence assessments indicated continued Warsaw Pact attention to depot infrastructure, reinforcing NATO's commitment to dispersal and hardening measures. Certain facilities incorporated protective features designed to mitigate blast effects and conceal storage layouts from aerial reconnaissance, acknowledging their high value in adversary targeting plans. Funding debates during this era often framed POMCUS expansion as a cost-effective alternative to permanently forward stationing additional divisions, balancing domestic political considerations with alliance defense requirements. The concept also influenced broader NATO standardization efforts, encouraging interoperability in fuel types ammunition calibers, and spare parts to ensure that multinational formations could operate alongside U.S. units drawing from POMCUS inventories. By mid-decade, the system represented not merely warehouses filled with equipment, but a synchronized network of infrastructure, maintenance personnel, transportation corridors, and activation protocols. Planners regarded POMCUS readiness as a measurable determinant of reinforcement credibility, linking depot inspection reports directly to strategic assessments of alliance preparedness. The existence of fully configured armored sets in West Germany altered adversary calculations by reducing uncertainty about NATO's capacity to generate heavy combat power rapidly. Through repeated testing and refinement, POMCUS became a tangible expression of NATO's forward defense commitment, anchoring deterrence in concrete, steel, and disciplined logistical procedure rather than in abstract declarations of intent. As the later 1980s approached, POMCUS reached its peak maturity in both scale and institutional integration, reflecting 2 decades of iterative refinement shaped by exercise feedback, doctrinal evolution, and infrastructure investment. By this stage, multiple heavy divisions worth of equipment were pre-positioned across West Germany, including armored, mechanized, artillery, aviation support, engineer, and sustainment assets, each configured to match specific U.S.-based units designated for rapid deployment. War plans detailed precise activation sequences, linking named divisions to specific depot clusters and defining the order in which equipment would be issued, loaded with ammunition, fueled, and dispatched toward assigned defensive sectors. The integration between airlift schedules and depot processing had become highly coordinated, with personnel arrival waves staggered to prevent congestion and to align with vehicle issue capacity at each site. Maintenance oversight during this period emphasized measurable readiness metrics, including documented engine start intervals, system diagnostics, component replacement logs, and inventory reconciliation audits, ensuring that equipment sets remained combat-capable despite extended storage. Ammunition storage and fuel allocation were coordinated through separate but synchronized facilities, allowing newly equipped units to achieve operational readiness without awaiting external resupply. Host nation agreements ensured rail priority and secured convoy routes linking POMCUS sites to key defensive corridors such as the Fulda Gap and the North German Plain, embedding depot activation within broader transportation networks. The expansion of secure communication systems improved coordination between depots, NATO headquarters, and arriving units, reducing the administrative lag that characterized earlier decades. Intelligence assessments continued to treat POMCUS sites as high-value strategic targets in adversary planning, reinforcing NATO's emphasis on dispersal and layered security. Some facilities incorporated protective construction features and camouflage measures designed to reduce vulnerability to reconnaissance and preemptive strike. Congressional testimony and NATO consultations during this period frequently referenced POMCUS capacity as evidence of sustained reinforcement credibility, particularly in discussions about balancing forward stationing with rapid deployment models. Exercises conducted in the final years of the Cold War validated shortened issue timelines compared to earlier iterations, demonstrating institutional learning accumulated since the program's inception. War planning simulations incorporated updated POMCUS performance data, refining expectations about how quickly armored brigades could integrate into active defensive operations. Even as political change began to unfold in Eastern Europe, the logistical architecture built around POMCUS remained intact and fully operational, reflecting its embedded role within NATO doctrine. The warehouses represented a concrete manifestation of alliance strategy, converting stored materiel into latent combat power that could be activated within days. The documented record of inspection reports, exercise outcomes, and infrastructure upgrades illustrates how POMCUS evolved from a cost-saving reinforcement concept into a cornerstone of forward defense planning. By anchoring reinforcement capability in prepositioned heavy equipment, NATO reduced transatlantic transit dependence and compressed mobilization timelines, altering the strategic calculus of potential conflict. Through disciplined maintenance, geographic dispersal, standardized configuration, and integration with rail and air mobility systems, POMCUS warehouses quietly prepared NATO for a European war by ensuring that reinforcement commitments were supported by physical readiness rather than aspirational planning. Beyond its operational function, POMCUS influenced NATO's broader force posture debates and strategic balance assessments throughout the 1980s, because the existence of fully configured equipment sets in Europe allowed alliance planners to reconcile political constraints on permanent troop stationing with military requirements for heavy combat capability. The program enabled the United States to maintain a substantial portion of its armored strength in the continental homeland, while preserving credible reinforcement timelines, reducing the domestic and diplomatic costs associated with permanently expanding forward garrisons. Defense planning documents reflected this trade-off explicitly, calculating the difference between maintaining additional divisions in Europe and relying on airlifted personnel drawing from POMCUS stocks, with cost efficiency and deployment speed weighed against vulnerability considerations. As tensions fluctuated during the decade, policymakers frequently cited the readiness level of prepositioned materiel as an indicator of alliance preparedness, incorporating depot inspection results into strategic assessments. POMCUS readiness also shaped NATO's ability to implement evolving operational concepts, including doctrines emphasizing maneuver depth and sustained conventional resistance, which required rapid generation of armored mass to prevent early breakthroughs. The documented performance of depot activation during major exercises provided empirical data that narrowed uncertainty in war planning simulations, allowing planners to replace theoretical mobilization curves with measured timelines. Infrastructure investment continued to reflect lessons learned, with ongoing improvements in climate control, fire suppression systems, perimeter security, and communications integration. Depot personnel were trained not only in maintenance but in crisis processing procedures, ensuring that issue operations could proceed under compressed timelines without administrative confusion. Intelligence agencies maintained surveillance of adversary assessments of NATO reinforcement, interpreting shifts in Warsaw Pact planning emphasis as indirect validation of POMCUS's strategic effect. Host nation cooperation remained central, with German authorities coordinating rail access, traffic control, and security integration to ensure seamless movement once equipment left depot grounds. The cumulative effect of these arrangements was a reinforcement model grounded in documented performance rather than declaratory assurance. By the closing years of the Cold War, POMCUS represented a mature logistical ecosystem connecting warehouses, airlift corridors, rail networks, ammunition sites, fuel pipelines, and maintenance units into a unified activation framework. Its presence altered adversary calculations by reducing uncertainty about NATO's capacity to field heavy formations quickly, reinforcing deterrence through tangible readiness. Even as geopolitical conditions shifted dramatically in 1989 and 1990, the physical infrastructure of POMCUS remained a testament to the logistical foundations upon which NATO war planning had rested. The warehouses symbolized a broader strategic insight that had defined the Cold War in Europe. that credible defense depended not solely on station divisions or nuclear guarantees, but on the disciplined preparation of equipment, transport, and sustainment networks capable of transforming latent material into active combat power under compressed timelines. Through decades of refinement, POMCUS warehouses had quietly shaped alliance strategy, embedding reinforcement realism into the structure of NATO planning and demonstrating that the outcome of any European war would have depended as much on stored steel in climate-controlled depots as on the maneuver of forces in the field. The documented evolution of POMCUS also reveals how deeply the program shaped NATO's perception of time as a strategic variable, because reinforcement credibility depended not only on the existence of equipment in Europe, but on the precise number of days required to convert stored materiel into operational combat formations. War planning models developed at NATO headquarters increasingly incorporated detailed activation timelines derived from exercise data specifying the sequence of personnel arrival, depot processing, ammunition loading, fueling, and onward movement to defensive sectors. These timelines were compared against intelligence estimates of Warsaw Pact mobilization speed, creating a measurable competition between reinforcement generation and offensive advance. The presence of POMCUS reduced the reinforcement window from weeks to days, but planners continued refining procedures to compress it further, recognizing that even incremental reductions in activation time altered deterrence calculations. Depot records show repeated adjustments to layout configuration, vehicle parking order, and documentation flow to reduce congestion during issue operations. Coordination with Military Airlift Command ensured that arrival waves were synchronized with depot throughput capacity, preventing personnel from overwhelming warehouse processing lines. Rail mobilization agreements were refined to guarantee priority allocation of flat cars and locomotives once vehicles departed POMCUS sites, linking warehouse readiness directly to transportation execution. Fuel pipeline networks and local storage facilities were aligned with anticipated consumption rates for newly activated units, ensuring that sustainment could begin immediately without reliance on external resupply. Inspection reports from the late 1980s demonstrate that readiness metrics were tracked rigorously, with maintenance logs detailing engine preservation cycles, component replacements, and system diagnostics. Intelligence reporting indicated continued adversary attention to depot dispersal patterns, reinforcing NATO's decision to maintain multiple geographically separated storage complexes. Congressional testimony and NATO consultations frequently referenced POMCUS capacity figures, translating warehouse inventories into strategic credibility metrics. The program's influence extended into procurement decisions as equipment standardization across units simplified depot configuration and reduced logistical friction during activation. When political transformation accelerated in Eastern Europe in 1989, POMCUS remained operational and ready, reflecting its institutional entrenchment within alliance planning. Although the geopolitical environment shifted rapidly, the infrastructure built over 2 decades remained intact, embodying the strategic logic that had governed NATO defense posture. The record of exercise performance, inspection documentation, and infrastructure investment illustrates that POMCUS was not an abstract contingency concept, but a physically verifiable reinforcement mechanism. It anchored NATO's war planning in measurable logistical capacity, ensuring that commitments to defend Europe were backed by maintained equipment sets, integrated transportation corridors, and disciplined activation protocols. Through this sustained preparation, POMCUS warehouses quietly defined the operational feasibility of NATO strategy, demonstrating that the credibility of alliance defense rested on steel stored under controlled conditions, ready to be issued within days under documented and rehearsed procedures. In the final analysis, POMCUS stands as one of the most consequential logistical programs of the Cold War because it transformed reinforcement from a theoretical assurance into a documented, rehearsed, and infrastructure-anchored capability embedded within NATO's war plans. From its initial implementation in the late 1960s through its peak expansion in the 1980s, the system institutionalized the forward storage of complete armored and mechanized unit sets across West Germany, reducing the strategic vulnerability created by transatlantic distance and compressing mobilization timelines from weeks to days. The warehouses were engineered, maintained, inspected, and repeatedly tested through exercises such as Reforger, producing measurable data on activation speed, equipment readiness, rail throughput, fuel allocation, and sustainment flow. These metrics were incorporated directly into NATO operational planning documents, replacing abstract deployment assumptions with empirically validated timelines. The dispersal of depots, the standardization of unit configurations, and the integration of host nation rail and highway networks ensured that stored equipment could be converted into operational formations under compressed conditions. Intelligence monitoring by both NATO and the Warsaw Pact confirmed that POMCUS sites were regarded as strategic enablers whose preservation or destruction would significantly influence early campaign dynamics. Funding decisions, procurement policy, and alliance force structure debates consistently referenced POMCUS capacity as a determinant of reinforcement credibility. The system also shaped deterrence messaging, demonstrating to allies and adversaries alike that heavy combat power could be generated rapidly within the European theater. Even as political transformation unfolded at the end of the 1980s, the documented readiness of POMCUS warehouses reflected 2 decades of disciplined logistical preparation. The program's legacy lies in its demonstration that credible defense depends not only on stationed troops or nuclear guarantees, but on maintained equipment, integrated transportation networks, standardized procedures, and measurable activation performance. Through sustained investment in climate-controlled storage, maintenance cycles, inventory accuracy, rail coordination, and airlift synchronization, POMCUS embedded logistical realism at the heart of NATO strategy. The historical record shows that these warehouses quietly prepared the alliance for a European war by ensuring that reinforcement commitments were supported by tangible materiel ready for immediate issuance. In doing so, POMCUS shaped Cold War war planning in a fundamental way, anchoring strategic credibility in documented infrastructure capacity and proving that the outcome of any potential conflict in Europe would have depended as much on stored armored divisions awaiting activation as on the forces already positioned along the inner German border.